Today's experience was sent to us by a 17-year-old girl. She had an encounter with Queen Elizabeth II in hell. She revealed the shocking reason why she was sent to hell. Kindly stay to the end to understand her experience. My name is Raina Caleb. The day I had this encounter started like any other day. I woke up to the sound of my alarm blaring at 6:30 a.m. The ride to school was uneventful, just the usual chatter and jokes from my classmates. By afternoon, the day had passed in a blur of classes and homework. I was relieved when the final bell rang. The school bus was already waiting, and we piled in, ready to head home. I sat by the window, as I always did, watching the familiar streets roll by. The chatter around me faded into background noise as I let my mind wander. I thought about the test I had aced that day and the series I planned to binge-watch later. Life felt normal, predictable. It happened so quickly. One moment, we were driving down the road, and the next, I heard a loud honk, followed by the screech of tires. A car had swerved into our lane, heading straight for us. The driver slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. The impact was violent. I was thrown forward, my head hitting the seat in front of me. There was a deafening crunch of metal, and then silence. My vision blurred, and everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, everything felt strange, like waking up from a dream that was too vivid to shake off. But this wasn't a dream. I was no longer in my body. I floated above the wreckage, watching the chaos unfold below me. The bus was crumpled on one side, its windows shattered, pieces of glass glinting in the sunlight. Smoke rose lazily from the car that had collided with us, its front end mangled beyond recognition. My eyes were drawn to the crowd forming on the roadside. Strangers stood frozen in shock, some clutching their phones while others pointed and whispered. The sound of sirens grew louder, filling the air with urgency. Then I saw myself. My body lay sprawled on the pavement, lifeless and still. My hair was matted with blood, and my uniform was torn and dirty. Paramedics surrounded me, moving quickly. One of them pressed their hands against my chest, trying to revive me. I wanted to shout, to tell them I was there, floating above, watching everything. But no sound came. I tried to move closer, but my body stayed behind, growing more distant with each passing second. I saw Grace too. She was sitting on the curb, tears streaming down her face as a paramedic wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. She kept looking in my direction, her lips trembling as she muttered words I couldn't hear. Time seemed to slow. Everything around me became surreal, as though I were caught between two worlds. I wasn't ready to leave. I wasn't ready for any of this. Yet, no matter how much I wanted to go back, I couldn't. I was gone. As I drifted further from the wreckage, a force beyond my control pulled me into a vast, shadowy expanse. The air felt heavy, thick with despair, and the surroundings were dark, yet not completely black. A faint, flickering glow illuminated what lay ahead. I found myself standing, though I had no sense of a body anymore, in a place that stretched endlessly. It was crowded with countless souls, their forms faint and blurred, as if they were shadows of what they once had been. The air was filled with their cries, a haunting symphony of anguish and regret. Everywhere I looked there was torment. Souls writhed in unseen pain, clutching at themselves as if trying to escape something that couldn't be seen but was deeply felt. Some fell to their knees, their silent screams piercing through the oppressive atmosphere. Others wandered aimlessly, their faces etched with hopelessness. The ground beneath me wasn't solid. It seemed to shift like a restless ocean, yet I couldn't sink or move far. Flames flickered in the distance, casting a dim light that illuminated the faces of the suffering. One soul, trembling and broken, revealed to me through their agonized expression that they were aware of every moment they had wasted, every chance they had ignored to choose a better path. Another soul passed by me, their form barely recognizable, but their movements told of endless torment, their silent revelations of longing for relief that would never come. In that moment, I realized that this was no temporary place of sorrow. It was a realm where every soul carried the burden of their choices, unable to escape the consequences. As I stood among the endless shadows, the weight of the torment around me began to seep into my thoughts. My mind, desperate for an anchor, clung to the one thing I always believed would protect me: my parents' faith. They were devout Christians, the kind who never missed a Sunday service and prayed fervently every morning and night. Growing up, their faith was a constant presence in our home. They always told me that God would watch over us, that their prayers would cover me no matter what. I never questioned it. I never thought I needed to. In the midst of this overwhelming place, I told myself that their faith would somehow shield me, that their goodness could pull me out of this nightmare. My parents had spent their lives serving God, so surely, I thought, I would be spared because of them. But as the cries of the souls around me continued, as the oppressive air grew heavier, it dawned on me that I was still here. Nothing was changing. My parents weren't here to save me, and their faith, strong as it was, couldn't reach me in this place. I began to understand something I had never truly grasped while I was alive. Faith was personal. It wasn't something I could borrow or rely on through others. My parents' prayers and devotion, though sincere, couldn't substitute for the choices I had made or the path I had walked. The realization struck me like a blow. I had always assumed their relationship with God would be enough for all of us, that their righteousness could somehow cover my shortcomings. But now, faced with the harsh reality of this place, it became painfully clear that I was accountable for my own soul. This wasn't a punishment for their failures. It was the result of my own. Their faith had offered guidance, but it had been my responsibility to follow it. Instead, I had brushed it aside, assuming there would always be more time. As the weight of the realm pressed heavier on me, I suddenly felt a presence, something dark and oppressive drawing near. Before I could react or even comprehend what was happening, grotesque figures emerged from the shadows. Their forms were twisted, like nightmares given shape. Their movements were deliberate and predatory, and their gaze locked onto me with a terrifying intensity. Without warning, their hands, if they could be called that, clawed at me. Their grip was cold and unrelenting, pulling me downward with a force I couldn't resist. I struggled, trying to break free, but it was useless. Every attempt only seemed to amuse them, as though my defiance gave them more power. The descent was swift and overwhelming. The further they dragged me, the darker and more oppressive the surroundings became. The faint cries of the souls I had left above faded, replaced by a different kind of torment, one that felt more personal, more specific. We entered a space unlike the one I had been in before. This part of the abyss was illuminated by flickering flames that cast eerie shadows on the walls. The air felt thicker here, almost suffocating, and the cries of anguish had a strange, haunting familiarity to them. I was thrust into this place, surrounded by faces I recognized immediately. They weren't people I had known personally, but their identities were unmistakable. They were the famous, the icons, the legends, the ones whose images and stories had been larger than life on Earth. The darkness around me felt suffocating, but my eyes couldn't turn away from the faces that were now etched in my mind. There, in the midst of the torment, I recognized them clearly. The images of Michael Jackson, Tupac Shakur, and others, famous names I had heard countless times, not from my own admiration, but from my older brother. He was obsessed with their music. The way their stories seemed to transcend the ordinary. Tupac was no different. His words were always woven into our conversations. "You gotta keep your head up," my brother would say, quoting Tupac's famous line, as if it held all the wisdom of the world. It hit me hard. My brother had always idolized these figures, spoke of them like they were immortals who had everything. But in this place, their fame was nothing. The music that had once given people hope, or strength, or escape, now seemed like an empty, fleeting illusion. I could almost hear my brother's voice in my mind, as if he were still quoting their lyrics, as if he still believed in their wisdom, their impact. But what did it mean now? It meant nothing here. Fame had done nothing for them in the face of eternity. Their lives, their accomplishments, none of it mattered. There, standing amidst the shadows, was a figure that stood out in sharp contrast to everything else. She was regal, dignified, her posture commanding yet serene. It took me a moment to realize who she was. Queen Elizabeth II. She was not like the others in this place. There was no frantic movement, no desperate wailing, no writhing in agony. Instead, her face was calm, though there was a deep sorrow in her eyes, an expression that seemed to tell a story far more profound than words could capture. As I drew closer, she turned to look at me, and for the first time, I felt a sense of recognition in her gaze. She didn't seem surprised to see me. When she spoke, her voice was soft, yet carried an undeniable strength. "I, too, failed to walk the path as I should have," she said, her words cutting through the silence. "The crown demanded more than I could give. The power I held was a burden, and in the end, it led me here." There was no defensiveness in her tone, no justification for the life she had lived, just an undeniable acceptance of the consequences. The burden of her role, of her position, had separated her from the faith she had been raised with. She confessed how, in the midst of her duties, she had neglected what mattered most: the personal relationship with God, the humility that comes from true service, and the acknowledgement that her reign could never save her. "I sought to do good, to serve my people," she continued, her voice breaking slightly. "But I could not keep up with God's demand. My responsibility to the throne overshadowed my responsibility to Him." Her words were full of regret, and as she spoke, I felt a deep sorrow resonate through me. It was as if she carried the weight of the world on her shoulders, a burden that ultimately led her down a path of neglecting her spiritual calling. In this place, she had no crown, no title. She was simply another soul, lost in the same way as the others, her hands clasped together in a gesture of remorse, as if seeking comfort from an unseen source. I neglected the call to humility, to service not just of people but of God. I thought that my role was enough, that my efforts for my nation were sufficient. But I was wrong. I failed to live in the light of His expectations. The regret in her voice was great, and it struck me deeply. In this place, her royalty, her legacy, and her reign were mere memories. Her title no longer held sway over her destiny. What mattered now was the realization that, despite her best efforts, she had fallen short in the eyes of the one who truly mattered. And in her words, I understood that the greatest regret was not in failing to fulfill her earthly duties, but in failing to live fully in the light of God's expectations. As I stood there, in the midst of the darkness and sorrow, something shifted within me, something I could not explain. It was as if a gentle force, warm and tender, began to stir within my chest. For so long, I had been consumed by fear, regret, and the weight of my choices, but now, in this place where time seemed to stand still, a faint light began to pierce the oppressive shadows. I felt a pull, a beckoning that wasn't from the demons who tormented the souls around me, but from a far deeper, far more powerful presence. It was as if something inside me knew I was not meant to stay here forever, that I had been given another chance, a grace I had not earned but had desperately needed. And then, before I could fully grasp what was happening, my body, my very soul was lifted. It felt as though I was being drawn upward, out of the abyss, out of the realm of torment. The light grew brighter, stronger, and with it came a deep peace that washed over me, soothing my weary spirit. I could feel myself being restored, not just physically, but in every part of my being. As I opened my eyes in the world I had once known, love God genuinely, wholeheartedly. Let Him be the center of your life, not just a part of it. Too often, we treat Him as a convenience, a fallback when things go wrong. But true love for God is a daily surrender, a conscious decision to put Him first in everything.